Okay, so welcome everyone. Also for the people who joined a little bit later, I would just like to remind you to mute your mics and to inform you that we are recording the webinar. The webinar, after the webinar, the recording will be published on the website, including a summary of the webinar. So mute your mics, turn off your cameras, and if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box. Put the name of the speaker you want to address your question to, followed by your question. I see everyone has joined by now, so welcome again to our webinar on measuring biodiversity for business and finance. And I'm now passing on the floor to Lars Muller, Policy Officer of DG Environment, European Commission.
Hello, everybody. A warm welcome to all of you who have joined us for this webinar on biodiversity measurement approaches for business and finance. I'm very glad that we are at this stage now because this is a key action also to implement the European Green Deal and the EU the EU Biodiversity Strategy that the European Commission adopted in May this year. Indeed, we have in the EU now an EU biodiversity strategy that includes a full section, a full chapter also on business, what business can do about biodiversity. And this is a full new political situation which we try to address now with a series of actions. One of them is this. What we try to do here is to better understand how can biodiversity be integrated into corporate decision making. The why for this is also a key question, which is addressed in, for instance, the Natural Capital Protocol, which will see soon a biodiversity guidance. Actually, tomorrow this will come out in a launch event. But how precisely can corporates assess and measure their biodiversity impact and dependencies? For this, increasingly, approaches have been developed and came to the fore, which brought us to the conclusion we need to help corporates, we need to help companies to find the right approach for their specific case, for their specific application on assessing their footprint on biodiversity. And this is this webinar series about. It will be hopefully a milestone on a journey that will continue with further projects and also with partners. And I try to stress the word partners. We are doing this not alone here. We feel in good cooperation with, for instance, the Natural Capital Coalition, with, for instance, the World Monitoring Center. So we are doing this also as a network of networks, trying to promote biodiversity into corporate decision-making, implementing thereby key EU policies on biodiversity, mainstreaming biodiversity into the private sector. With that, I don't want to spend more time on this and rather hand over to the concrete work that Johan is leading. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lars. So my name is Johan Lammerrand. I work for Arcadis, and I am the methods workstream leader for the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform. So I'm trying to deal with figuring out how all these biodiversity measurement approaches for businesses and financial institutions are functioning and which metrics are being used. So a few words from my side before we start the presentations. Over the past 2 years, we have mainly been assessing methodologies on their own, so not so much case studies, but we have assessed about 12 different approaches, and you can find the results in 2 assessment reports which are available on the platform's website. So I really recommend you to take a look there. Now, from this year on, as we see that the number of concrete case studies where these different biodiversity measurement approaches have been applied is increasing, we think it's extremely useful to also focus on these case studies, because these case studies will provide us with much more insight in the real strengths and weaknesses or opportunities for improvement, if you want, of all these different methodologies. And this will also allow us to better support you in finding a suitable measurement approach. So concrete actions for this year or for this autumn, let's say, is first of all, we have this webinar series on case studies. So this is the first out of 5. We really recommend you also, if you can, to also join the next ones. Today we focus on site level, but further this week we have one on product level, then we have one on supply chains, we have one on corporate level, and we have one even for the financial sector. What I also want to mention is that we are developing a uniform template for case study description and assessment, because we want to avoid that all tool developers develop their own case study descriptions, which will be very confusing for interested stakeholders to find their way. So a uniform assessment template, which will be assessed by an independent quality review panel. So at this moment, we have almost compiled the team of quality experts, quality review experts, and we can start assessing case studies over the next weeks when these will become available from the tool developers. And finally, it's also our intention to further strengthen the decision framework on how to select the right biodiversity measurement approach. But of course, these series of webinars will also help us a lot, and definitely also your questions and comments. This being said, I don't want to spend too much time anymore on the introduction, so we can start with the first presentation, which will be by Leo Murphy of UNEP-WCMC, who will give more insight in the biodiversity indicators for site-based impacts methodology. Leo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Johan. So yes, as Johan's just said, my name is Leo Murphy. I'm a program officer at UNEP-WCMC, where I've been working on the biodiversity indicators for site-based impact methodology over a number of years now to develop the methodology and also to pilot it. A number of you may be familiar with this methodology under its previous name. We used to call this methodology Biodiversity Indicators for Extractives, but we've made a conscious decision over the last couple of months to alter this name in order to broaden the methodology's appeal, because we feel it's actually applicable to a much wider range of companies who have on-the-ground impacts on biodiversity. If you could move to the next slide. So yeah, this is a joint initiative. We've been running this now for a little over 2 years. It's a collaboration from UNEP-WCMC, Fauna and Flora International, and Conservation International. And we've been lucky enough to be supported by IPICA, the Oil and Gas Association, the Proteus partners, 7 of our piloting companies who we've been working with closely over the last year to pilot this methodology, and also the Biodiversity Consultancy, who've supported us in the piloting process, and our wider stakeholder group, including the advisory group that's been reviewing various different drafts of our methodology as we have developed it. If you can move to the next slide. So I'd just like to start this presentation by giving you an overview of the methodology itself, and then go on to the case study, which I'm going to present today. If you go to the next slide. So the methodology itself is a 3-stage process, the first of which is this high-level screening of biodiversity significance for all sites within a company's portfolio. And what we aim to do here is to provide an indication to companies of which of their sites has the highest biodiversity significance and therefore has the highest potential impact as a result of their actions on the ground. And part of the information that companies can draw out of this is that they will then be able to identify which sites they need to elevate to stage 2, in which they will have a much more detailed assessment of the impact and interaction with biodiversity at a site level. So this stage 2 looks to identify what are the elements of biodiversity at that site that are likely to be impacted by the company's actions, and then assesses these on a state pressure and response framework, which I'll come on to discuss a little bit more in a moment, in order to produce a site level dashboard identifying the company's performance on biodiversity at that particular site. The third stage of the methodology will then be to take all of the information about sites that is gathered through stage 1 and stage 2 and aggregate this together up to a corporate level where it can be used to inform higher level decision making surrounding biodiversity and the potential impacts the company may have upon it. If you move to the next slide. So the first stage, as I said, is this biodiversity significance screening. What we do here is we take a number of global data sets and we screen the sites using these data sets to identify the potential significance. So this starts with defining the assessment boundaries in terms of how many sites within the company's portfolio will be included. For companies with a smaller number of sites, it may be appropriate to run this for all of their sites. But for example, if you have a company with several hundred sites, it may be appropriate to, for example, if you're an oil and gas company, to exclude downstream oil and gas where your impacts are not predicted to be as high as upstream. And as we said, we run this through a range of different data sets and screen this against some criteria, which I will discuss on the next slide. And then we validate this with site managers. So we actually take this information that we've derived from the global data sets and talk to site managers about whether this actually accurately represents the realities they have on the ground, in order to make sure that we have the best picture of what might be occurring at that site as we possibly can. If you can move to the next slide. So as part of this screening, we have adopted a traffic light system from low, medium to high potential significance, and we screen against 3 different criteria for each site. So we look at the number of threatened species present within the area of influence for that site. We screen against the potential overlap with critical habitat, whether this is the physical footprint of the site itself, or if critical habitat occurs within the area of influence for that particular site. And then similarly for protected areas, we look if there is overlap between physical footprint or direct and indirect area of influence. And as I've mentioned, we use global data sets for this. So for threatened species, we look at the IUCN Red List species range data, which is available through IBAT, the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. And similarly for protected areas, we look at the World Database of Protected Areas, again available through IBAT. And for critical habitat, we look at the critical habitat screening layer, which is available from UNEP-WCMC via our Ocean Data Viewer. What we aim to do, once we have run this through the global data and then we've validated the results with site managers, is to produce a list of sites ranking from high to low in terms of the significance on these 3 different criteria, in order to identify which are the priority sites to move through to stage 2 for a much more in-depth assessment of the potential impacts the company is having on biodiversity at their sites. If you can move to the next slide. So as part of stage 2, what we do is we look to identify what are what we call focal biodiversity features at that site. So what are the key elements of biodiversity that occur at that site that the company is likely to be impacting? And we review existing and available data to identify the state of those biodiversity features, the pressure the company is placing upon them, and the response the company is having to mitigate those impacts. And as part of that, we also look to identify where there may be any potential gaps in the data that's available to most accurately understand the company's impacts at that site. And at the end of this second stage, we look to produce a site level dashboard, which displays all this information in an easily interpretable way that can be used to guide decisions at the site level. If you move to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we look at this on a state pressure response framework. This framework is a widely accepted framework, not only within conservation, but also within business. And what we're looking to do is see shifts from the red scoring for state pressure and response up towards the green. So for example, for state, we will assess this based on the amount of the focal biodiversity feature remaining compared to pre-project conditions. So for example, if the feature is wetland habitat, then we may measure the amount or the area of wetland habitat remaining compared to the amount that was present immediately prior to the project beginning at that site. For pressure, we then look at this in terms of its timing, its scope and severity on that particular biodiversity feature. So for example, this might be the rate of habitat loss within the physical footprint occurring within those wetland habitats. And then we look at the response the company is having in terms of its level of planning to mitigate those impacts and whether or not the implementation of that plan is on target. And the objective for this is that, as you see on the right-hand side on the graph, the idea will be that a company will be able to shift its response from the red to the green. And over time, this should lead to a similar and comparable increase and shift in pressure from red to green. And then again, depending on the biodiversity feature in question, with another time lag, there will be an increase in the state from red to green of that biodiversity feature. And the actual time lag that we see here will depend on what the feature is. So for example, if we're looking at invertebrate populations, the time lag may actually be relatively short. But if you're looking at the impact on perhaps a forested habitat, then that time lag will be much greater. If we can move to the next slide. So the final stage of the methodology is this aggregation to corporate level. And so far, what we've done with our development and our piloting is really refine the first and second stages, with our methodology now presenting a robust screening of sites within a portfolio and this comprehensive site level assessment. And this
Hi, Leo. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, it seems to have muted itself there. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. If you could just take it back from the beginning, from the third stage, please.
Yes, not a problem.
Thank you. And Lenny Tonoyo, could you please turn off your camera?
Oh, sorry. Okay.
So, sorry, yes, just to recap, the third stage will be the aggregation to corporate level. And so far, our piloting and our development has focused on refining the first and second stages of the methodology to present this robust screening of sites within a portfolio, and also the comprehensive site level assessment of biodiversity performance. And this third stage for aggregation will be the focus of piloting in 2021, and which is something I will come on to talk a little bit more about at the end of this presentation. If you can move to the next slide. So I'll now just look to present one of the case studies and give you an outline of what we've been doing over the last year to actually implement this methodology. If you move to the next slide. So our piloting process has been underway now, as I said, for about a year with 7 different companies. And we've piloted the methodology at projects covering both the marine and terrestrial sites across Africa, Australia, Europe, and North America. We've included sites from oil and gas companies, we've included mines, renewable projects, and also social investment sites where the company doesn't actually have an active extractive or productive operation, but is investing in the improvement of biodiversity as part of its wider corporate goals. And these sites have included both pre-project, so planning phases, and also operational phases of site activity. And these case studies will be presented as standalone documents that will be available alongside the methodology and the various different tools to support it on our website, with the idea that they will be able to present companies with an indication of, first of all, what are the potential outcomes for them by applying this methodology, and also to highlight what some of the challenges may be in implementing the methodology and how these may be overcome. If we can move to the next slide. So we're now pretty much at a stage where we've either finalized or are in the process of finalizing all of our pilot studies. And there have been a number of sort of common lessons learned throughout them. The first of which is that the initial creation of the dashboard for stage 2 is quite an intensive process in terms of time, but actually once it's developed, the updating of it with new data. So for example, if you were to repeat this as part of a monitoring program each year, the actual updating to do so is much less time intensive. We've actually been able to trial this at a pilot site where we had some quite strong time series data, and we were able to update as if we'd been assessing this over multiple years. That there is a key need to understand data availability, quality, and consistency as part of the assessments of biodiversity features during stage 2. And that on-site capacity to engage in the process is really key. So as part of our piloting process, we've been working with companies with the support of either ourselves or some of our other partners, so Conservation International, Fauna and Flora International, or the Biodiversity Consultancy. But actually the availability of site level managers to support us is really, really important to get an accurate picture of what's happening at site. And finally, that a narrative alongside each assessment is needed in order to explain the results and interpret them in a way that companies are able to see a clear pathway of how they can improve their performance. So not only telling them where they're performing badly, but actually what are the key steps they could take to help improve that as they go forward. Next slide, please. So to present one of our case studies in a bit more detail, we've been working with Anglo American as part of this project, and they have been piloting the methodology at their Kolomela mine in South Africa, which is an open cast iron ore mine. And they've been doing this in part supported by Fauna and Flora International, who have an ongoing understanding of the site, having worked there on a number of other projects in the past. The mine itself has been operational since 2011, and we've identified as a precaution an area of influence of 50 kilometers around the site where there may be potential impacts on biodiversity. If you move to the next slide, please. So we conducted this, as I mentioned, through a review in the first stage of global data sets via IBAT and the critical habitat screening layer. And then there was a validation process with site managers. And while for the majority of the assessment, site managers agreed with the global data, there were a number of species, in particular, some of the larger mammals, so rhino and cheetah, that were identified by site managers as not being present in wild populations. There were a number of managed populations within protected areas and private reserves, but no wild populations. And so we did remove these from the list for this particular assessment. And this stage 1 process took approximately a day of time to conduct. Using IBAT and the critical habitat screening layer is relatively quick. And then it just takes a little bit of time to validate with site level managers for them to review all of the information that we present. If you can move to the next slide, please. Can we move to the next slide? Sorry, thank you. So here are the results for the first stage screening. So we identified that for this particular site, the significance in terms of protected areas was medium, as there was one protected area that was overlapping with this 50-kilometer area of influence. With regards to critical habitat, significance was low, as there was no critical habitat either overlapping with the physical footprint or with the 50-kilometer area of influence. And that for threatened species, significance was medium, as we identified 2 critically endangered, 4 endangered, and 10 vulnerable species within the area of influence. And we weight this total to give a higher significance to critically endangered species than we do to endangered and vulnerable. And using this approach, we then draw out the highest level of significance across any of the 3 criteria and use that as the site level significance. So here we can see that both protected areas and threatened species are medium, and so the site was given a biodiversity significance of medium. Next slide, please. So for stage 2, when we did the in-depth site assessment and produced a dashboard, it was conducted using a review of site level literature and guided through the methodology. And the key reference for this, alongside the site manager themselves, was the Biodiversity Action Plan and the baseline data to support that that was produced for the site. And this process took approximately 12 days to implement. We move to the next slide.
2 minutes, Leo.
Thanks. So the focal biodiversity features identified at site. So these were screened against a number of criteria. First of all, vulnerability. So this is whether or not the company's actions at site are likely to impact the particular features, whether they're species or habitats. Suitability, so whether or not the species or habitat is useful to use as an indicator. And this takes into account both whether it is feasible to monitor it. So for example, certain very elusive species may not be suitable to monitor because you may not be able to collect enough data on which to understand patterns in their abundance. And also significance, so whether these species are threatened or important at a national or global level. And as part of this, we identified 6 habitats that were used as focal biodiversity features, and these were grouped together as biodiversity management units, and also 4 species or species assemblages, which were also progressed to be focal biodiversity features. Next slide. And so this is the dashboard that was produced as a result of this. So you can see that the traffic light system highlights the areas in which there is need for further attention. So we can see here that state is variable across the features, with habitats in the direct impact area experiencing the largest declines and being in a poor state. We can see that pressures are generally low or medium for a range of biodiversity features, again with the exception of habitat loss and dust deposition within this direct impact area. So some of the habitats within that area of the mine being more significantly impacted. And that the response overall was medium across all biodiversity features. The implementation of the plan is on schedule. However, since the Biodiversity Action Plan was developed, Anglo American have now adopted a net positive impact commitment. And so the plan has been identified as needing to be updated in order to reflect this new commitment. And another key part of this, as we highlight in the final column there, the data confidence. For the majority of them, our data confidence is high, level 3 being the highest it can be. But for a number of the features, in particular the wildcats, it was not possible to get this quantitative data. And actually expert opinion was needed, and that's why you see this indication of level 2. And we also highlight that for pressures upon wildcats, actually some of them are unknown. And this highlights to Anglo American that there is a need to prioritize these in order to get a better understanding of what their impact at site may be. Next slide, please. And just a couple of sort of pieces of feedback from Anglo American, who unfortunately were unable to join us here today. So the environmental manager at site has highlighted this as a good way for them to indicate biodiversity value and the effectiveness of their management for conserving it and improving outcomes for biodiversity.
Can you wrap up, Leo?
Sure, yes.
Yeah,
and then at a corporate level, there was sort of key highlights that this is good for understanding where their impacts may be highest, and also a key highlight on being able to collaborate with other companies and having a standardized methodology for conducting this kind of assessment. And just if you move to the final slide to just wrap up, as I've mentioned, we will be now progressing to piloting the third stage of the methodology over the next year. And one of the key things that we'd like to highlight here is that if there are any companies on the line listening to this who will be interested in potentially piloting this method, then please do get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to discuss both your needs and what this methodology could offer to you. Thank you. Johan. Yeah,
thank you very much, Leo, for this very concrete case study presentation. We immediately go over to Maria-Alice Alexander from Life Institute. Maria-Alice, the floor is yours. Maria-Alice?
Sorry, I'm here. I was talking without seeing the phone. Sorry for that. Okay. Good morning. I am in Brazil, so that's why it's still morning here. I'm here today to explain and showcase our business and biodiversity tool. Next slide, please. Life Institute was established in 2009, and we were created to promote the engagement of the business sector on biodiverse conservation and maintenance of ecosystem services. Our headquarters is in Curitiba, the south of Brazil, and we have representation in Spain. Our work is linked to development of methodologies. We are a standard setting organization, and we manage our software LifeKey. Next, please. Yes, so how does our methodology work? We have 3 steps of the methodology. The first one is the state, the first diagnosis, the picture we take from that company. What do you do in this stage? We diagnose the situation regarding the evaluation of the business management, and we work on the landscape, the characterization of the landscape surrounding the organization. After taking a picture and diagnosing the company, we measure the pressure with biodiverse pressure index and also biodiverse minimum performance for that company. And we analyze the ecosystem and impacts and dependencies. Once we took the picture and we understand where we are, we calculate the pressure, we require response. Which kind of response? A concrete biodiverse action plan and improvements on management indicators in order to prevent impacts for the future. Next one. This table is the result of the study performed by European Business and Biodiversity Platform. As you can see, Life can support several business applications. Next. Our business case today is about Posigraph Printing Company. You can go next. So it's a site level assessment that we did. Posigraph is a printing company in Latin America, belongs to Positive Group, was founded in 1972, and it was the first Brazilian industry to be recognized by third-party audit as a Life certified company. It was in 2014. Next, please. So following the 3 steps, we started by the first diagnosis. We did an initial evaluation of the business operation. We checked the ecoregion identification, the hydrographic region where they are, the conservation priorities, threatened species, all using, of course, data available, international methodologies, international data as well. And we are also identified what they've done so far. What's the implemented conservation actions done by Posigraph? On this topic, next please, you can see, next slide please. As you can see on the location characterization of the landscape, where Posigraph is located, which ecoregion is included on this, what's the threatened situation or the fragility of this ecoregion. Okay, so this is one of the information we get at the beginning of the analysis and diagnosis. Next, please. So once the first diagnosis was performed, we started step 2. We calculate the Biodiversity Pressure Index, BPI. We assess the quantity and severity of 5 environmental aspects. We calculate the individual pressure index for each of them, and we understand the impacts, dependence on ecosystem services. Next one. So how do we measure? I'm not going to go into a lot of technical details, but basically we do energy, we calculate energy consumption, waste, greenhouse gas, area occupation, and water usage. And for this is the concrete information for the Biodiverse Pressure Index for Posigraph in 2019. This is measured every year, but I took here 1 year for you to understand. So Posigraph BBR index is 6.50. And you can see underneath a BPI scale. What does that mean? This scale goes from 0 to 1,000. The bigger the index, the bigger is the organization pressure on biodiversity. In the case of Posigraph, it's a quite clean company. But if you take, for instance, we did more than 30 pilots checking the methodology, a refinery or a gas company, it can go over 700. So this is the results of a printing company and quite a clean and organized company as well. This sort of calculation I'm showing here is very important because this allows any organization to compare their business units and also to compare themselves with other sectors or to compare themselves in the same sector because we use the same methodology. Okay. Next. So still on step 2, after we measure the impact and the business pressure index, we also check the ecosystem impacts and dependencies. This is very clean information of all the calculation and all the results we had. So you saw that Posigraph has higher impact on greenhouse gas, energy, and waste, and higher dependence on water because they use a lot of energy, and energy in Brazil is generated, most of them, for energy, for water or hydroelectric power. They are also dependent on raw material as planted forest and chemicals and soil conservation, important for planted forest as well. Next one. So once we did the first diagnosis, we understood the picture, we calculated the impacts, we understood the dependencies. Now we require response from the organization. What's your positive response? We've done all this. What are you going to do pragmatically, concretely? So what we work with the organization, we elaborate a biodiversity action plan, evaluating and scoring biodiverse conservation actions, we calculated the biodiverse positive performance, what they have to do, what's the minimum they have to do. And also we work on improvement of conservation actions and projects. Some companies are doing something, but they don't have any indicators, any specific indicators to measure it. So we also work on improvement of their actions and projects. At the same time, in the same step, we also work on the management indicators. What we look here, we understand that the company has to show the effective and real commitment regarding impacts reduction, supply chain evaluation, and other important information. So not only we measure everything, but also we require a very critical response on management improvement. Next slide. So Posigraph positive performance. They have adopted a wonderful reserve in Brazil, in Araucaria Forest. Next, please. The Uru Reserve is located in Paraná, as you can see here, in Araucaria Forest in the south of Brazil. Next one. They adopted 129 hectares of Araucaria Forest. It's a moist forest, Araucaria moist forest ecoregion, has only 1% of the remaining natural area in Paraná. So it was a very critical ecosystem, and the strategic decision from Posigraph to adopt this area. Next one. Here you can see some conservation results. Flora species monitoring, next. Fauna species monitoring, it's a wonderful area. Very important area in this region. And still on response, as I told you before, we asked the company to improve the biodiversity management. We don't want paying for trash company. You've got to do something better. So Posigraph made all the analysis, the implementation of international agreements. They understand their role on that. Developed a technical biodiversity action plan. They also did a lot of control on their data collection, and they evaluate in a better way regarding biodiversity impacts their supply chain. Next. The supply chain, it was critical. They identify 100% of direct suppliers, and they run biodiversity impact assessment. They require their suppliers to run as well on their direct suppliers, Tier 1 and Tier 2. And they follow minimal requirements for the purchasing policy as well. Next, please. So Posigraph has been certified. Next one. So how they were certified? Because Posigraph made a response higher than the pressure. In this slide here is very simply showed. Biodiversity minimum performance required was 22,700 points, and they've done more than 50,000. So Posigraph not only made their work in a concrete manner, but at the same time, they have credit for that. They did more than they were supposed to do for the life certification, minimal conservation actions. Next one. And of course, all this calculation became critical. We developed the LifeKey software next. The LifeKey software was, next one. Supports biodiverse disclosure reports. So we have a standardized information on biodiverse pressure and performance. We have a quantitative and comparable data, and public summaries are available. So you can enter here in this website that we are showing, that every company using the methodology and certified by Life has all the information disclosed. On the other hand, if you want more details about our methodology is transparent, is public, and you can find all the details in our website. Next one. Where we are today. So, after promoting more than 30 business cases in Brazil with all kinds of companies in all sectors, we learned a lot in these 10 years, and we improved a lot the methodology in order to make it much more robust and complete and straight to the point. Our goal is concrete actions. What are you going to do after you measure everything? What's your minimum performance in order to compensate your residual impact, and how you improve your impact as well? We are today in Latin America, and we have adapted our methodology for 27 countries in Europe. We are piloting this adaptation in November 2020 in Spain. Next one. So now I have 6 minutes, so I was very good on timekeeping. I'm going to ask Jean Guimarães. Jean Guimarães is the president and owner of Posigraph and shareholder of Positivo Group, which is a huge educational group in Brazil. And I'm going to let him say what was his experience regarding the LIFE methodology. And I thank you for your patience, and I will hand over to Jean Guimarães for his statement. Thank you.
Well, good morning to you all, or good afternoon. I would like to tell you a little history, very, very fast. So, Posigraph is part of an educational conglomerate, Positivo Group. And we were born to print school books. Further on, we have developed a broader commercial printing service. We devoted to this normal commercial printing service market. But we still have printing educational books, one of our main activities. And competition within this market have always been very, very hard in Brazil. Therefore, we have always looked at for some differentiation strategies. And as you know, printing is totally attached to paper consumption, which is directed related to tree consumption and processing. In southern Brazil, the Araucaria forest used to cover an area of approximately 200,000 kilometers. And it's a very sad story. Today we have only 1% of its original area in reasonable state of conservation. So what we found in life certification was a very robust and very effective way to make our customers and the stakeholders understand that in Posigraph we were very serious when we talked about preserving biodiversity. We have always been committed to environmental policies like FSC certification, but that is not really a differentiation for us. We wanted something more, and life certification was the way we found to show our stakeholders and to the broad market that we were not joking about it. We were not greenwashing case. We were really doing something in terms of biodiversity conservation, which has have been producing very nice results. We, I would say, have won some customers and maintained other customers thanks to this effort that we have been doing for more than 15 years right now. So we have a very good relationship with the certification, and we are very happy with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation of the live methodology case in Brazil, and also thank you for keeping to the time. Now I would like to welcome Frank Hawkins of IUCN, who will tell something more about a concrete case study with regard to the STAR methodology, the species threat abatement and restoration metric. Frank, up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan, and everybody for the opportunity to participate here. Very good forum to be able to talk about these issues. I want to present to you today an example of how we apply the species threat abatement and restoration metric in a specific landscape in Indonesia. This is a collaboration between the company that's managing the concession and the people who are working on STAR, that include around 50 different organizations. The technical components of this methodology have been developed in collaboration with Newcastle University, and there's a publication in review in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, which should be out in the next month or so, that gives you the details of the methodology. So I'm not going to preempt that, except to give you a very quick high-level view of what it is the STAR methodology is intended to do. Next slide, please. So the purpose is to measure the potential conservation gain that can be gained for species through action that's taken within a particular geographical area. That doesn't have to be a corporate footprint or a site. It can be a landscape or a province or a country or the globe. And it does it in two ways. It assesses what you can do to reduce threats, and it shows you what you can do to reduce species extinction risk through restoration of lost habitat. Next slide, please. To do this, you need to acquire data on species, including their threat risk, their the risk in the red list, and also the threats that apply to them in the classification scheme, the scope and severity and the timing of threats. And then you need to know where the species occur. And you do that through looking at what we call the area of habitat calculation. That's a thing which I can come back to if anybody's interested. Next slide, please. The really important thing about STAR is that it gives you a metric, a number that can be compared at sites or across sites. So you can see what the opportunity for reducing species extinction risk is at one place and compare it numerically with what that might be in another place. And you can also add them up. So you can say if you have 10 sites within one country and 10 sites within another country, you can see that the collective species extinction risk reduction potential across the 10 sites in one country is different to that in the 10 sites across the other. And you can also see what the contribution of those 10 sites is to a global target for conservation. And this is going to be, we hope, part of the metrics that will be used in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Strategy, specifically for species conservation. So companies will be able to assess the extent to which they've contributed to those global targets by using STAR. Next slide, please. You can see how these opportunities for conservation are scattered across the globe. You can see that countries like Madagascar and Colombia and Peru and Indonesia and China have very high opportunities to reduce species extinction risk. But using STAR, you can also see what those, in the bottom right-hand corner there, what threats need to be abated in order to generate those outcomes. And here it's, you need to abate the threat of invasive and problematic species in order to generate those STAR scores. Next slide, please. In order to do that, you need to think about a couple of issues. So for the moment, we are using data on terrestrial vertebrates. We'll include these other taxa over the next couple of years. We need to measure threats in more detail at the site level, and we don't address newly emerging or worsening threats. Next slide. The way we apply this at the site level is in a 3-step process. I hope this will come up. Yes. So you do an estimated ex-ante analysis, which is based on existing published information that's in the red list. And this gives you a preliminary evaluation of a site, the potential of a site to contribute to threatened species conservation. You can then refine that to give you a baseline ex-ante, where you validate the data that's on the ground with field work or consultation with experts in order that you have an updated map, and that allows you to set targets at the site level, which shows you in the ex-post phase your progress in implementing management that allows you to deliver those targets. And in this, we have a very specific linkage with the mechanism that Leo presented earlier, the SBI, where this can provide a way for results that are generated using SBI to flow upwards into the policy framework, because SBI will allow you to calculate the star scores that you generate in a site. It could also be used as a data input layer for the LIFE initiative that we just heard earlier just now. So it's very much focused on organizing data that occurs at the site scale and for deployment in a range of other contexts based on its relationship to global contributions to species extinction risk reduction. So to talk quickly about the site level case we have, next slide please. The Bukit Tiga landscape in Indonesia is in the middle of Sumatra. You see the blob there. It's a project that's implemented by Royal Lestari Utama, and the work that we did in it was supported by Synchronicity Earth. Next slide. The Bukit Tigapulu landscape is an area of about 150,000 hectares in the middle of Sumatra, which is a combination of a plantation for sustainable rubber, a protected area, and areas for restoration. There are lots of interesting aspects of the socioeconomic context with local areas of hunting. There are issues related to subsistence cultivation, all things that you often find in the tropics. And there are quite a lot of people who live in the landscape for which the primary outcome that you're looking to generate is a sustainable livelihood option. If you go to the next slide. So the structure of this is quite interesting in that it's very linked to a global finance effort where you have a sustainability bond that is funded by international banks and implemented by a landscape finance facility in Indonesia. And then you have a joint venture between two companies, one of whom is a local finance institution and the other is the buyer of the rubber. And there's a range of different ways in which the sustainability impacts are being generated, but ADM Capital is the basic agency that wants to be able to link what goes on the ground to global conservation targets. Next, please. So the landscape is very complicated, as you'll see in the next map. What we've done is try to analyze the opportunity for species extinction risk reduction across the whole of this landscape using STAR. And I'll come back to the details of this in a minute, but you can basically see the blue areas are areas where restoration of habitat will generate concept species threat reduction, and the orange areas are where threat reduction will be able to deliver that directly. And there are two basic areas to look at. One is the orange on the right, and the other is the bright red on the left. Next slide, please. I want to give you an indication of the species that we're dealing with. These are the species that are identified using the ex-ante estimate phase. These are ones that are present in the red list, and they tell you that you can generate conservation impacts by reducing threats on these species, some of which, such as the Sumatran elephant and the Sunda pangolin, are critically endangered, and others of which are vulnerable. The important aspect of this analysis was that these are aspects of the conservation opportunity that weren't available to the site managers before this analysis was done. If you go to the next slide, through the red list, you can then analyze what the major threats are to those species, and they are from annual and perennial non-timber crops, that's mostly rubber, but also small amounts of other things, oil palm, logging and wood harvesting, which is a thing that accompanies rubber production in large areas, and also collecting terrestrial animals, the hunting basically that goes on in association with presence of people in forests where the opportunity is there. And what you can do with the threat analysis is you can show what proportion of the total opportunity for species extinction risk reduction is in Sumatra, for Indonesia, and for the global target that we might want to identify during the post-2020 biodiversity strategy, which will be finalized at the CBD COP next year. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the opportunity for reducing species extinction risk can be broken out geographically using this analysis and focusing on the orange area on the right, where you can reduce threats to species that occur either in or adjacent to the protected area, the national park, and they include particularly focusing on reducing the amount of habitat that's being lost for them and also reducing hunting pressure. There's a lot of old forest that's been cleared in the blue areas, which you can restore, which will have a significant contribution to threat reduction in those areas as well. So we're not just talking about a kind of an action to reduce activity in threat reduction, but you're also talking about a positive employment generating opportunity in restoring pre-existing habitat. And then there's a little blob on the left there, the red blob, which is the distribution of a critically endangered species of bat that only occurs in that area of forest. So you can focus your actions in there and generate some very efficient species extinction risk reduction results. If you go to the next slide, a very quick analysis of the management recommendations. You have, in order to get to the next phase of action, and this is where the link to the SBI metric comes in, you need to confirm the presence of the threatened species and the threats that apply to them. You need to set threat reduction targets. That's what will give you the flow of, if you like, the star units that will show you've contributed to global and national targets. Plan the restoration plans that will enable you to join up existing areas of habitat and maximize the opportunity for species extinction risk reduction through species movements. And then monitor all that as you go with action on the ground, which also, of course, will create employment opportunities for local people. And that gives you then an opportunity to show in your corporate disclosure that you've contributed to metrics or outcomes that are compatible with global targets that you can then say are contributions to the global effort to reduce species loss. The really important part of this is that, as you probably know from the efforts underway to generate emissions reductions for the UNFCCC, the 1.5 or 2 degree target, the way we formulated this is through emissions reductions based on reducing tons of CO2 equivalent. This is essentially a parallel kind of measure that tells you what you can do to generate effort globally through lots of different actors, including what they call non-state actors, companies and finance institutions, to deliver that kind of overall target. And it's very hard to do that in other ways where you don't have comparability between efforts between different sites. Next slide, please. That's the quick summary of where we are with that project. I hope I got in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Now we even have some minutes, so you did a fantastic job to keep to the overall timing. So now we have for Q&A. For specific questions related to STAR, you can still give your questions in the chat box. And we have noted a few questions for Leo and for Alice. Maybe starting with the first question to Leo. how to manage risks related to the increase of biodiversity value when you start restoring and rehabilitating a mine site, because this is a typical issue for companies. They are often afraid of the increased biodiversity values because then there are additional compliance issues maybe that will arise. Is this something that has been considered within your initiative?
Yes, I think that was a really good question that I saw coming through in the chat. So the area that would change in our methodology would be the first stage. So the significant screening would potentially go up if you restore an area and that brings in new species of threatened status into the area. But that is only the significance part of it. It doesn't give an indication of what your impact on that species would be. And actually, when you progress that site through to stage 2, the fact that your actions to restore the area have actually led to that species coming in to the mine site would show that you have put that in a very good state, and that your pressure upon it and your response to managing that pressure are also very good. So that is all connected through, and it would show up in stage 2 that you are managing that potential risk well.
Okay, thank you. And maybe, Leo, there was another question for you. What if the impact is irreversible? And very often in the case of quarries, the impact is indeed irreversible. But how do companies compensate for that? Can you tell something about that?
Yes, so another good question. And so if you go into the details of the methodology document, the way that we assess response, and one of the criteria for response is that the company is following the mitigation hierarchy. And so that will first of all lead to avoiding impacts and minimizing them, and then to try and restore them. And if that's not possible, as in the example here, it would require the company then to look to offset those impacts somewhere else. And so it will be this offsetting that will be the potential way to compensate for some of the irreversible on-site impacts if they were to occur.
Okay, thank you. There are a few questions for Maria-Liis. First of all, a very short question. I think the Posigraph company and the exercise that you did for Posigraph, was it a compliance issue or was it a voluntary exercise for the company?
It is voluntary, so compliance is business as usual. They've got to be compliant anyway. After compliance, what else they could be done concretely and effectively to compensate their residual impacts?
Okay, is this your experience also with do you have the same experience with the other companies that you are supporting with the LIFE methodology?
Yes, of course. You know, compliance in Brazil, or the rules for compliance in Brazil, are quite high, quite tight. So even some companies complaining that they do already too much. Biodiversity continues to decrease. So in fact, only following the business as usual and the legislation is not enough. Mm-hmm. So, and they've got to understand that what they do, it's not something philanthropic. Is real need for preventing their sustainability for the future, for preventing having issues on raw material and water, that we have the biggest water crisis in Brazil. So companies, they have to go outside their fences to understand what's going on.
Okay. Thank you for that one. Another question, you refer to the fact that the methodology will also be applied in Europe. Can you tell something more about that?
Yes, our methodology is adaptable in any type of country. So we've got to understand what's the conservation priorities, what's going on in terms of threatened species in the area. So the methodology is not an universal one. Some part of the methodology are universal, but most of the part of the calculation methodology has to be adapted. Once we started doing it, just a few adaptation in some countries in Europe, and we noticed that we could do more. We could do a regional adaptation. So we started last year adapting the methodology to 27 countries in Europe. There's a lot of data available in Europe, so it was much easier than it was in Brazil and some countries in Latin America. And in November, we start piloting. We start checking if all the calculation, the life key methodology, everything that we've put together can work already in Spain, for instance. And so we are going to start the piloting in November for Iberdrola, which energy company, where we are working with Iberdrola in Brazil as well, diagnosing their areas as well.
Okay. Another question for you, Alice, is does the LIFE certificate stimulate the use of 100% recyclable paper? Is this somewhere covered in your index?
Yes, it's part of the management indicators. I mean, once you want to be a company reducing your impacts, you've got to do everything you can to have only residual impacts, things that cannot be done, cannot be reduced. So we stimulate, of course, 100% recycled paper, but the company is not obliged to, but they have to show their interest and they have to show they can start doing something. They have a plan. So in the case of Postgraph was very clear for that.
But having a plan, if I may, Alice, having a plan is nice to promise. But is there a system to do a follow-up then?
Yes, we follow up because we have a 5-year certification methodology and monitoring. So if they put together a plan, they've got to show advance. They have to show improvement each year. So third-party auditors, they've got to understand that the company has promised something, has put together a plan on biodiversity or on the management system or on reducing the pressure. Everything is clean, it's very well proposed or suggested at the beginning of year 1, has to be followed up and monitored each year. And if they don't do, they lose the certification.
Yes, okay, thank you. Going on with the LIFE methodology, there were a few questions on that. How do companies calculate the effect of transport? Is transport a factor in your calculation?
Yes, if the company, when we calculate the footprint or the biodiversity index on the company, we first of all decide the scope. Are we going to be only the site level, or are we going to see all the other third-party services like transport or other units, or is a corporate? So our LIFE methodology is first of all decided within the company what they want to do. But transport is included since the beginning, because transport is part of the logistics that a company are. That's why Postgraph have a higher index on gas emission, because transport is included. They use quite a lot of transport as well.
Okay. Another question, Maria Alice. What tool do you use to calculate the benefits of compensation measure, like compensating protected forests? Is it included in the biodiversity pressure index?
No. The biodiversity pressure index is an indirect index, calculation index of footprint, the negative index of a company. Where we calculate the positive, we calculate the preservation of the area, threatened species, how the area is conserved, what are the indicators, what's the biodiversity indicators, all scientific data that we use in order to measure it and to see if the action being undertaken by that company is really concrete. We had experience with some companies doing quite a lot of actions that with no indicators, no information available. So it was a big risk for them paying things or addressing things that they don't have reliable information and concrete data and indicators to check their actions. So it's for sure on the positive impact, we check everything on the area. So like Uru, the business case, every year they pass into monitoring to see what's the situation and if they've done progress conserving this area, etc.
Okay, thank you. I also see a comment from your colleague Reggiani Borsato that the public reports of live certified companies are available on the website, so all participants can have a look to see how these public reports look like.
Yeah, it's not available on our website. It is available on the third-party certification office website.
Yeah.
Okay. The website I showed there. In our website, you have all the methodology information public, and all the details are there as well.
Okay. I have a general question on collection of species data. There is a global biodiversity facility available. Are people using this information, this data source, or can you tell us something more about the data collection issue? Because for many companies, this is really a challenge.
I can give a quick answer to that.
Yes, Frank, go on.
So GBIF collects data from many different sources, and one of the ways in which it is used in the IUCN Red List is at the point at which each species is assessed for its extinction risk, the GBIF data will be considered by the experts who do the extinction risk review for that species. So it's part of the underlying input, the data set that goes into the calculation of what we use in STAR for the area of habitat, which is the underlying distribution map of where the species occurs that you can then use to assess the potential of a site to contribute to species extinction risk.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any, yes, questions are coming in. Just a moment. Question to Maria-Liis. Suppose that your methodology would become standard procedure in the EU. Is there any indication about what is needed in terms of institutional and logistical capacity and extra efforts of companies?
In fact, making or performing all the development of this methodology in Brazil was a wonderful lab. Brazil, which has quite a lot of biodiversity still, so we took 10 years testing and doing all the work. In Europe, of course, it was easier due to the fact that many information is available, but we still have a lot to do. We have already a technical team working in Europe, and we have to pilot in some countries. So if you have some countries or some companies wanting to pilot with us, it will be excellent, as we did in Brazil, more than 21 pilots in the past. So we would be wishing to have candidates in order to support us on piloting. The data collection is available, so we do all the data collection is already, it's not so much time consuming because all the organizations, they do this kind of collection as well. They do gas, they understand the situation, all the information, it's available. That's why we create a methodology which could be easily applied. The most important goal that we have is gain scalability. The more we have companies adapting or adopting the methodology, the more concrete actions we will have on terms of biodiverse conservation and ecosystem services. We want candidates, we want companies wanting to test it, being our pilots, and at the same time being piloting. Quite a lot of companies will, frankly speaking, improving the methodology based on our experience in Brazil was very important, and make the methodology available much more robust than it is right now that we are starting in Europe. So we have really the feeling, and we would love to have companies adopting and supporting us on the piloting of the methodology for Europe.
Yes, thank you, Maria-Liis. I assume that, of course, this is also an invitation from the other presenters, because we want to emphasize that the objective of this webinar on case studies is to share with you the available methodologies for measuring biodiversity. And of course, the more case studies we have, the more pilots we have, the more the methodologies are being applied, the more the more we will know about the strengths and weaknesses of biodiversity measurement, and the easier it will be to get biodiversity measurement getting mainstreamed in the business community. Maybe one final question before we go to the final words. Let me see. What is? It seems that that's a comment from Frank. It seems that the three methodologies presented are quite complementary, and we might be able to look at seeing how the best aspects of each could be combined. Yes, thank you, Frank, for that comment. I think it's a very relevant comment. We see indeed more and more that instead of picking one specific biodiversity measurement approach, that there is merit in combining several approaches, as is the case with metrics, because up to now there is still not one and only biodiversity metric, but we more and more we tend to the idea of having a dashboard of metrics, where you rely on several complementary biodiversity measurement approaches. And this is something that we are exploring now also within the EU Business and Biodiversity platform, and where we will report on much more in the next assessment report. I don't know, Lars, if you want to say some final words, maybe also on the align, on the initiative to align and standardize biodiversity measurement approaches in the future. From my side, anyway, I want to thank you all for participating in this first webinar, and I can only invite you to join the next ones. Thank you. And Lars?
This work is ongoing, so please stay tuned, I would say, because further webinars are coming, and we will continue to assess those biodiversity measurement approaches, also with new projects coming online soon. So I would only say stay tuned, and we should be working together on improving these different tools for the right applications. Thanks for now, and see you soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.